Episode 6 of the second season of the live action, and this is the beginning of the end, the final arc to be adapted this season. Also, I have a cold, which is annoying, but we move, and I've said my most anticipated arc here was Little Garden because of how much I love the Giants, but I'm sure the majority of fans coming over from the anime or manga would say this is their most anticipated arc of this season, in no small part thanks to a certain character who was easily the biggest question coming into this season. How do you bring this guy to life? As good as everything else may be, the answer to that one question could make or break the season in a way, because he's by far the biggest part of it. But also, this arc and these final 3 episodes are much more than just him, so there will be spoilers for the anime and manga up to and including the latest chapter. That is your final warning, and here is my review / breakdown for episode 6 of season 2, titled Nami Dearest. And we begin with a live action original scene, but one I am a fan of. We have a meeting between Robin, Miss All Sunday and Walpole, accompanied by his 2 henchmen, with the main reason for why this scene works being how it expands the Baroque Works plot to flow through each arc to give them a greater presence, because to the best of my memory there is zero Baroque Works interference during Drum Island in the anime or manga, which also made perfect sense because going to Drum wasn't on the agenda, you know. The only reason we end up there is because of Nami's sickness, which forced us to deviate from our original course straight to Alabasta, so it wouldn't be something Baroque Works would have seen coming in advance, because we didn't know it was coming in advance. And that's another great thing about this new scene, because it's a new addition that works within the canon of this adaptation without forcing comparison with the anime or manga, kind of like the scene in episode 1 where they follow the trail of Mr. 7 to get to the Straw Hats, which again, even though the fight between Mr. 7 and Zoro is canon to the manga, all of those scenes were also live action additions, so I think the inclusion of this meeting also works very well. And as for the actual contents of this scene, Walpole was expecting to meet Crocodile, who was otherwise occupied. I wonder if that was only for the sake of keeping his physical appearance and appearances close to the chest to make the final cliffhanger more impactful, or if whatever he's supposedly doing here has some kind of relevance in the future, because according to Miss All Sunday, he's tying up some loose ends, aka the Straw Hats and also Mr. 3, who failed. In the original, he sends Bon Clay to go dispose of Mr. 3 for his failure after the call with Sanji, who he thought was Mr. 3. Even though here he finds out it wasn't Mr. 3 on the call, that's still enough to prove his failure, you know? You've allowed the enemy to get in contact with me. That's a massive blunder. So maybe that's what Crocodile is doing here. He's in contact with Mr. 2, Bon Clay, to deal with Mr. 3, but that means Walpole has to settle for the second in command here, though I would argue that's the much better option with Miss All Sunday Robin, who's wearing an outfit that looks very similar to her most iconic outfit maybe from Water 7 and Enies Lobby. Anyway, Walpole's not in the best of moods. He thinks he deserves some repayment for his financial contributions to Baroque Works, so he kind of has a direct hand in aiding them in their plans in Alabasta, meaning his connection to Vivi goes beyond the incident at the Reverie. And I love the comment from one of his men, I can't remember their names, it's the archer, who warns him about his blood pressure. It's one of those things where you think, yeah, I guess it does make sense they still have to worry about those kinds of issues, because in this world where we have a talking reindeer, a boy who stretches like rubber, people who are made out of and control the elements, you don't really think about this kind of stuff. But yeah, high blood pressure would still exist, I guess. Plus, we know Walpole has an insatiable appetite, and his palate is about to infinitely expand because we actually see him get his devil fruit as compensation for all his support. I don't believe we have any idea of when he ate it in the manga, but we can put together he found it on Drum Island since he was only out at sea for a couple months. But it's cool to see it play out like this, because this may very well be how it happened in the manga as well, we don't know. Because his metal jaw I always thought was because of his abilities, though that is not the case. And it's time to reclaim his kingdom now that he's gotten a boost, but also thanks to Blackbeard leaving the island, the first mention of one of the final villains of the entire story. I'll say the final villain because I believe he and Emu both will be in the final war. It's gonna be a triple threat free-for-all between each of them. But anyway, he was on Drum for a still unknown reason, and it's funny because this question has come up again very recently in the manga, since we learned a couple chapters ago that somehow Chopper is able to literally slap the evil out of the Domi Reversi giants, which has revitalized the discussion of his fruit really being the power of the forest god. So maybe Blackbeard was there to collect that devil fruit but was unable to find it since it had already been eaten by a reindeer. There was another theory about him being from Drum Island, although that's been proven wrong thanks to the God Valley flashback, but since we heard Buggy saying he doesn't sleep in the Oden flashback, and Luffy saying in snowy countries the people don't sleep, that maybe there was some connection, but we still have zero idea. And finally on Walpole, before moving on, I'll mention this here here since it is his first appearance, but in my opinion, in terms of costume design and execution, Warpole is the best of the bunch. If we're talking about being faithful, they smashed it out of the park. The steel jaw is really well done. I already said I thought it was a result of him eating his devil fruit, like it protects and helps the efficiency of the user's mouth, since they now can eat anything. So a new idea could be that his eating ended up getting so out of hand that he ruined his own mouth, broke his jaw, maybe a katakuri situation, which forced him to get a metal jaw. His armor and his hair are also very well done, plus his woolly hippo cloak even, though we don't see his actual woolly hippo Robson, who actually would have been really cool to see in live action, though it's okay he isn't, because I'm sure that was one of the easier cuts to make. So now we move over to the Going Merry, where Nami has finally woken up after 4 days thanks to her illness, which looks like she's being taken over by a symbiote or something, but the makeup looks really good too. Nami looks tired, she looks drained, she's lost all her strength, and we see Sanji getting a bit emotional here, which is something that comes back later in the next episode, or the final one, but it's another piece of the story brought forward, in a way, but it's brought forward from a point we are never going to reach with this adaptation. I would have really loved to see the scene here where Luffy is goofing around to try and cheer her up, give her some energy, but the Gum Gum powers are hard enough to pull off in the show as it is. So maybe it's not the best idea for some complex up-close uses of the ability that may not look the best. Any kind of skin VFX are really important because we all know what skin looks like, how it stretches, how it moves. So any deviation from that is gonna look kind of weird, and then we have Luffy who stretches like it's nobody's business. Even Mr. Fantastic wore a full costume in the First Steps movie. So Nami's health is our #1 priority, and to get to Alabasta we need her at 100%, meaning even though this is an unexpected change in course, we are still on course in a way. So we have the first appearance of Drum Island from a distance, with the mountains, the Drum Rockies, already clearly visible from this distance, and this isn't really relevant, but on the topic of Blackbeard going to Drum, another theory that I'm a huge fan of about Drum Island in general is that the Drum Rockies can actually be played like drums, to play the tune of the Drums of Liberation, and maybe they were used back in the day, during or even before the Void Century, because everything was bigger back then. Zunisha, Nidhogg, the Skull of Onigashima, all of which are several kilometers in size, so it doesn't seem out of the question for me, and the idea of these massive drums being played so the Drums of Liberation can be heard all over the world is such a cool idea. So I always think about this theory whenever we see these mountains, whenever we visit Drum Island. Back on track though, Vivi gives us a bit of a heads up that there's some political tension between Drum and Alabasta, so yes, we want to get Nami some help and we aren't going to turn away from the island, but this may not be a smooth ride. Not that anyone was expecting it to be though, I'm sure. And as we sail closer to this island, the soundtrack that plays and builds here is so, like, grand. I wasn't expecting for such an epic OST to play for this moment with, and I don't know if there's any technical term for these vocals, but I'm just gonna say opera, but it sounds very good, and it's always these kinds of epic soundtracks that are the ones that stand out to me. And you know what, it is actually kind of fitting because we transition to Pangaea Castle in Marijua for the Reverie back when Vivi was only a kid, so that OST does make sense when you're moving to one of the most important events in the One Piece world. And of course, with hindsight, we can call this the Reverie that takes place in Marijua because this scene also happened in the original, but without a few details because the concept wasn't fully fleshed out yet, so we can bring that back around here. Instead of calling it the Council of Kings, we can call it the Reverie. Instead of having the monarch sitting around a large but still small and kind of regular looking wooden table, we have the round table with the symbol of the world government in the middle, and all of the other monarchs are as outlandish and stereotypical as they are in the anime and manga too. The king in the green and the cactus hat sitting right next to Wapol. We have Abraham Lincoln. We also have the king of Lulusia, who talks like an old school vampire. Is great, no diluting the colors or the personalities. As for the subject matter here though, we start on the topic of the warlords. I'm sure that was purposeful to hint towards the true identity of Mr. Zero, Crocodile, one of the 7 warlords of the sea, and we also get a mention of Otohime's assassination and a dig at Jinbei for not being able to prevent that, which I think is honestly a very interesting point because regardless of how it actually happened, with Hody Jones and all of that, Jinbei is like the only warlord to ever use his position for the sake of good instead of using it as a shield so he could do what he wanted. And this isn't even the first time he's been mentioned in the live action either, so for any live action onlys who've paid attention, in season 1 when Arlong was meeting with Captain Nezumi, he mentioned one of the warlords being a fishman, and Arlong responded to that by saying Jinbei is a fool, obviously because of their bad blood, partly due to Jinbei becoming a warlord. So from these two sentences, new fans can actually put together some key information. Although I am saying saying this as a guy who knows all of these details, so maybe it's not so easy. Other shows will have lines like this where they talk about what's happening in the world, but the story will never go there, it's never expanded upon. But in One Piece, it's always expanded upon, so to say people need to pay attention is an understatement. But the main concern here that needs to be discussed is Dragon, leader of the Revolutionary Army and known only as Dragon, so his Monkey D lineage is not known to the world yet, the world doesn't know he is the son of Garp, and all of this you can infer in the original too, that Dragon being Monkey D Dragon wasn't public knowledge, but it's cool to see it being explicitly stated because, I don't know, I feel like some people in this community need those kinds of details like Dragon's true lineage not being known publicly to be spelled out for them. And this is Wapple's cue to intervene because he believes himself to be the greatest thing to ever happen in the history of happenings. He talks about Drum and how under his rule it's prospering, but enter King Cobra of Alabasta, whose actor I do recognize but I can't exactly place where from. He looks good, the hair, the puffy goatee, all very nice, and he gives a great speech about what it means to rule, what makes a kingdom, and he gives us the only mention of Wapple's father here. We saw him in a brief flashback with Dalton in the original, but it was an understandable cut. I doubt most people even remember that we met Wapple's father to begin with, but as for Wapple himself, I think this scene is really great for him because it shows he can be a bit of an idiot, a goofball, a dick, but at the same time kind of threatening because the way he shouts at Cobra here saying he is the kingdom is really good. Then we catch up with Smoker and Tashigi on their hunt for Baroque works, which leads them to a communications outpost that has seen better days, so they need to keep their guard up, and I really enjoy the chemistry between the two of them here, obviously because of how well they embody their characters, but also just the general vibe I get from these two. Really small things like the size difference, even Smoker looking down, Tashigi looking up, while still talking candidly, I really like it. But the main thing to come out of this scene is the closest thing we're gonna get to a live action original character, because we have Miss Thursday, an agent of Baroque works who we never saw in the original manga in any shape or form, in no SBS or anything, and was only ever mentioned once by Vivi, but her presence here does make sense since she's the partner of another agent who we'll get to later. So as you'd expect, she has a very One Piece design is probably the best way to describe it, and we also get her canon manga design too, which Oda drew along with the character for this season, and she is the younger sister of Mr. 4 who we meet in Alabasta, which makes things kind of awkward because Smoker kind of breaks her neck by deflecting one of her baseballs back at her, so it would be a nice touch if Mr. 4 mentions her death or her absence in season 3. And as for her now former partner, Mr. 11, who we do actually see in the anime and manga because he is captured by Smoker and Tashigi tied up on their ship, so maybe we can say in the original story, Miss Thursday ran off and abandoned her partner, which is why he was caught and she wasn't. Or like in this episode, she was killed, so it would be of no use to them to bring her along. And it looks as though the reason these two were here was to stop the Marines from uncovering information about them, since we do also see men and transponder snails taken out. So now Tashigi is the one to take out Mr. 11, taking his sword, which is a graded blade, so that is one step closer to her achieving her dream of collecting all of the famous swords, which is never going to be achieved because she is never going to be able to take Zoro's swords, she is never taking Mihawk's sword, she is never taking Venus Juro and Elder's sword, she's never taking Imu's own blade, which is either one of the 12 supreme grade blades or is so old that it predates the grading system. But either way, if Tashigi as much as sees that blade with her own eyes, it's gonna be the greatest miracle in the history of miracles. Now it's back to Drum Island, where we receive a very unwelcoming reception leading to Vivi getting shot, and it's also her own diplomacy that leads to them being allowed in. We know and we see later on that as a princess she is very accustomed to diplomacy as compared to Luffy and the others who are ready to destroy this place, and to be honest I can't blame them because they didn't even do anything yet. And yes, we can't blame the people either because of what they've been through themselves, but still, to shoot completely unprovoked, while understandable, is still very frustrating, especially when, as the scene moves forward, Vivi doesn't even get a direct apology from the person who shot her. All she says is sorry pirates, which is fine, but also personally apologize to the person you just shot. And this person is actually Maria, who in the anime and manga Luffy and Usopp mistake for a hiking bear who they need to bow to, making for one of my favorite running gags from the arc. But on the bright side, we also meet Dalton, who looks great, smaller than the OG Dalton, but that's not a problem because I doubt they would have been able to find a suitable bodybuilder or strongman for the position, because that's the kind of build Dalton has. But again, the outfit looks really good, the green and the fur, the armor, the hair, which is arguably even bigger and more exaggerated than the original Dalton, though the best thing about him here is the performance, because the face he has here and he will wear for the rest of the season, which is this perpetual look look of tiredness, despair, guilt, which is exactly Dalton, you know? No shade on the other villagers, but really he's been doing all the heavy lifting around here. And he catches us up on why everybody here is so on edge and so distrusting of outsiders. There was an incident a couple months ago where Blackbeard arrived and attacked the island, and we are told just as little here as we are in the anime and manga. Who knows what actually led him to Drum Island? Just for fun, for Chopper's fruit, for something else, who knows? Maybe we'll find out in 5 years time when we finally get his backstory. 5 years is a bit generous, 10 years time. What happened after God Valley, before he joined Whitebeard, after he killed Thatch, and before we meet him on Jaya. But this place hasn't been doing so well since Warpole fled as soon as Blackbeard showed up. Not that they were doing particularly good under his reign either, so they have every reason to be suspicious and fearful of others. Still, a personal apology to Vivi would have been nice. And as for Nami, there is one doctor left who can help her. We hear all these crazy stories that the villagers have about this doctor, Kureha, and how she travels with a beast and all of these wacky conspiracies that surely cannot be true at all. Surely. But to get to this doctor, they will need to take a path on the far side of the mountain. But it's too late to take it now, so their best chance is to wait until tomorrow morning. So that's kind of the same as the original, where there is a safe but longer path and a riskier but quicker path with giant humanoid rabbits known as Lapans, although they are not included in this adaptation, which I did see coming. But I would have liked to see the scene where they protect Luffy carrying Nami and now Sanji too from Warpole and his men. But these rabbits still do exist somewhere on the island, even in this adaptation, because we see the skin and fur of one stretched out in the village, maybe to be used for the sake of warmth, like clothing or bedding. And even without the rabbits in our way here, we still have to climb up the mountain because we need to get Nami some help as soon as possible. So there is no waiting until morning. She is worth the risk of taking this 5-kilometer shortcut. So the climb begins with Sanji also coming along with us, meaning without the rabbits here to cause the avalanche and injure him, he climbs the mountain on his own behind Luffy carrying Nami, instead of Luffy needing to carry him up as well. And even though it isn't mentioned, we know Luffy has to climb step by step instead of stretching and reaching further to climb quicker, because even though he can, and doing so would get them to the top sooner, he's the only guy made of rubber here. Going back to what Robin told them after Whiskey Peak, your friends are not made of rubber. So while Luffy can do this with no issues for himself, Nami, who is already suffering, will suffer some serious whiplash from all the stretching and rebounding on top of everything she's already going through. So it's just not an option. The only option is the hard way. Then we return to the flashback of Vivi at the Reverie, where we see some more of her diplomacy skills. First, where she makes a deal with Igaram so neither of them get in trouble. And the reason I like this part specifically is because I always think in any movie or show when a kid is getting scolded for something, especially for stuff that isn't too major, it's always framed as the kid's fault, when actually the parent or teacher or guardian or whoever is also at fault here, because it's meant to be their responsibility to make sure the kids are safe and stay out of trouble. So I enjoyed seeing Vivi stand her ground here, and also that Igaram is just a very good guy, because for whatever reason, in real life, the adult ego shatters into a million pieces whenever they lose an argument to a kid, or you know, whenever the kid is right. It's like, how dare you make sense? So that's the first example of Vivi's diplomacy, and we see that she has some history with Warpole, who in his anger slaps Vivi for standing in his way, even though she's clearly standing closer to one side and he has plenty of room to walk around anyway. He also doesn't take responsibility once he finds out who Vivi is, but it's really funny to me how, and I have no idea if this is intentional, and I don't even know if I'm right because I'm not an expert on American accents, but it's the way he says Alabasta in an Alabama accent, or at least what I think is that accent. So while Igaram is ready to start a war between two kingdoms who even outside of this incident would have some history since they are basically neighboring islands, it's Vivi who stands up to take the responsibility on herself and apologizes. So she had this level of maturity and understanding of how the world works from a very young age. I don't know if this is going to be included in season 3, but we know when she was even younger she met Koza, and to begin with they weren't too fond of each other, but Cobra chose to leave them to settle their differences themselves, which led to them becoming close friends. So you could say this time and this incident with Koza, where she was left to deal with her own problem, was kind of where she first developed or showed the maturity of a future leader, which was tested here with Warpole and in the present with the villagers. Back in the present we see her, Vivi, along with Zoro and Usopp inside, having been left to do nothing but wait, leading to Usopp snapping at Zoro for hovering over him, not doing anything productive. And I love this not only because of what it shows for Usopp as a character, but because it's in character. This is something he would do. We know that he will often go and start to do some tinkering or fixing up the Merry to give himself something to do so he doesn't get overwhelmed by the situation or his own stress. And the biggest example of this is Water 7, where fixing up the Merry
definitely was his stress, so it's definitely still in character for him to snap like this. And it also shows how close and understanding they are that Zoro can get shouted at like this by Usopp but can brush it off because he gets it, he understands the situation. So he goes to join Dalton on watch, meaning he and Usopp have themselves covered. They are doing something, leaving Vivi, who can just sit there with her mind dwelling on everything that's going on here and in Alabasta. She thinks she isn't helping, she's feeling useless, so Usopp talks to her about the burden she's carrying, which reminds me very heavily of the scene in Alabasta where her and Luffy get into a really heated argument, because that whole scene is based on Vivi wanting to take everything on herself. She should be the only person who needs to suffer. She doesn't want anyone else to die, even if they are fighting for their own beliefs. And here now, the reason they are on Drum Island to help Nami is because the crew chose to bring her on board. So there we have one more thing she blames herself for. But there is no point in thinking like that, because you should instead focus on what you can do, even if it's as small as passing Usopp a wrench, because that is still helping. And the climb continues, the snow really blasting into them as they move up the mountain. Luffy's lips are blue, his face is dropping because he's losing strength, and even though he doesn't need to carry Sanji with his teeth himself, he still has to catch him and fling him to the top of the mountain before finally reaching there himself. The OST playing here is really good, and even though it isn't as gritty and harsh as in the anime where you can see Luffy's nails splitting apart and breaking as he tries to cling to the mountain, I think they still did a good job in getting across how difficult and painful this climb is with his hands covered in blood and his face having lost color. Like, sacrificing their own bodies was worth the cost if it meant saving Nami. So we see the castle as Luffy collapses, and we get our first glimpse of Heavy Point Chopper, who has come out to carry them into the castle as he does in the manga, and obviously we see this form clearly and fully later on, but in this scene alone where Chopper is kept out of focus, I think they did really well to capture the vibe of a mysterious creature showing up, and with him being obscured, it did give a kind of unnerving vibe for me. And apart from his foot, which we do clearly see step up, you can't tell at all with the rest of him that it is a practical suit here. So again, good job at giving him a presence while keeping his appearance hidden. Then back in the village where we get a small talk between Dalton and Zoro, who just joined him on watch. They talk about the people finally starting to recover from all of the hardships they've had to endure, but that Dalton doesn't intend to lead them, only shield them. So in a way, it's similar to Vivi, where he intends to take all the hits on himself to spare everybody else from any more suffering. And I'm also sure he says this because of how he feels about himself, because I talked about before how his face always looks as though he's not doing good. He's always under a lot of stress and guilt, which is all true. And maybe part of the reason Dalton doesn't intend to be the people's new king is because of his own part to play in their former king's heinous acts, because we see in the Reverie that even after he saw Wapol hit Vivi, yes, he apologized, but he still continued to serve that man, knowing full well this definitely wasn't the first incident. He's caused so many problems over the years for the people of Drum, and he continued to serve him all the way up to Hiriluk's death. So even though we know he didn't agree with any of what Wapol did, he still stood by as Wapol did all of this. Yes, it's to do with his own honor and Wapol being the successor to the former king who was a good man, so maybe there was lingering loyalty from there. Wapol wanted to help the king's son, but still, and as much as he's led and helped the people up to this point now, what right does he have to rule them with his own role in indirectly facilitating their suffering? That may be taking it a bit too far, but I don't doubt Dalton might actually be thinking that about himself. Now back up at the castle where Nami finally wakes up in a room that has a very warm and cozy vibe, so I'm a fan of that. A place of warmth and comfort on this snowy island, and she looks across the room to see a furry little creature wearing a giant pink hat. We see Chopper in all of his fuzzy glory. His appearance isn't a massive surprise since he was a massive part of the marketing leading up to this season. He had whole trailers and teasers and Netflix event reveals dedicated to him and how they were going to bring him to life, but they definitely did make the right choice in the way they adapted him. Keep him as a cute half plushy looking creature because that's a big part of his charm, but also because that's just how Chopper looks, even in the pre-time skip. I did hear they wanted to make him look like more of a realistic reindeer, and they would have done so if Oda didn't make them go with the cute and fuzzy route instead. So the fur looks great, his eyes are really expressive. I'm not sure what they were thinking with the realistic look. Like, how would that appearance work with how emotive and emotional Chopper and his story is? We have Michaela Hoover doing the voice, and while the original voice actress in the anime is never going to be top, I like this voice here too. I'm really happy they kept the gag of him not knowing how to hide properly, and all in all, this is Chopper, who is not alone because we also have his teacher and the one who actually took care of Nami, Dr. Kureha, who's given like her own entrance music as if she's a wrestler, and she looks incredible. Like, there's no way Katie Segal, who is playing Kureha, is actually 70 years old.
cold. She has the looks, the attitude, but the main thing here with these two is the way they interact with each other, because one of the main things with CGI characters to make them feel like they're actually there is to maintain a consistent eye line between characters, which they are able to do. So it feels as though they are looking at Chopper instead of a vague empty space where Chopper is gonna be. And the reason they pulled it off so well is because they had another actress to act as a stand-in and do some motion capture for him, so in a sense Chopper was actually there. Luffy and Sanji are also recovered, and I love the rest of this scene. Like I said before, it's a very cozy vibe, and I really enjoy the back and forth here. Luffy's fear of being cooked alive, their relief of seeing Nami awake, their candidness with Kureha, and the episode ends with those two seeing Chopper for the first time. And I said this when I saw the scene in the trailer, but this line where Luffy shouts, "What is that?" I think is genuinely some really good line delivery, because for me it sounds like real and authentic excitement coming from Luffy, because he very slightly stumbles over his words here when he shouts, and that makes it feel even more genuine, because like he's so overwhelmed that he can't even speak properly. But before that we see Chopper looking back at them really awkwardly, like he just stands there for a second with a smirk, and it's so funny because it gives me the vibe of back when you were a kid, when somebody was over at your house and either your parents make you come and say hello or the visitors notice you themselves. So you really awkwardly just stand there smiling as if you're letting them examine your appearance or something before walking off again, and it's a tiny interaction but it always felt so humiliating. That is the exact vibe I get from Chopper here. So there is the first episode of Drum Island, where we were introduced to the biggest piece of merchandise that this franchise has ever known, but more than that, the fan favorite character Tony Chopper. We had some great moments for Usopp, Vivi, even Warpole, who is already so easily hateable from the small number of scenes he was given, and that is exactly the kind of vibe you would want from him. But this is all just the beginning, because there are still 2 more episodes this season, both dedicated to this arc, with one certain character who completely steals the show. So next up is my favorite episode of the entire season and the entire adaptation so far, where we continue with Drum Island.